Hey friends, this is the Mrs. Wolfie from Our Half Acre Homestead. Now this is part 2 of the Simple Tide Quilt. Okay folks, I'm really sorry. When I went from part 1 to part 2, I did not show the cutting out of these blocks. You saw me sew the strips together. But these are the blocks of the strips that were cut together, and these were cut at 6 1/4 inch widths. You would pin your rows together, and you would pin them at the joints from the block. Okay, here's what I mean by pinning them. I've got my rows here. I'm sewing the 3rd row on. And what I've done is, as you can see, one block will be straight, like vertical, and the block I'm sewing it to will be horizontal. And that's the way you want your rows laid out. But I am pinning them, if you can see, at each end of this block to the block underneath, just to support, oops, sorry, blurry there, just to support the joints until we sew through them. Okay, here are 3 rows sewn together. Now, of course, obviously the threads haven't been trimmed and it hasn't been ironed, but you get the general idea. I'm going to look at my row here, and the row I just finished starts with a vertical block, so we want this row to start with a horizontal, okay? And as you can see here, it is getting pretty close to being done. Now we have 8 rows, and as you can see, each row begins with an alternate block. See, these ones are going horizontal and these ones are going vertical. So that way, as you step back, it's almost a, I think they call this Roman road, only I didn't have any color scheme whatsoever. So we've got a couple more rows to make, and then we're going to put it all together. And we're going to start pinning on another row. And as you can see, it's vertical and horizontal opposite. So what we're going to do is, because this is a long row, it's 12 blocks long, and I think what I might do is I might make it 14 blocks long and 12 blocks wide if I have enough blocks. But we're going to pin these all down the length at the juncture of pretty much every seam we have, so that everything stays nice and firm and straight. We're matching up the corner seams to make sure our blocks are not out of place. We'll be back when I have this row all pinned on. Okay, we have our row pinned on, and we're just going to run it through the sewing machine. We are just going to, and I'm going to back stitch at the beginning of each one, and I might even back stitch every time I reach a seam, just to make sure it's nice and strong. But you're going to double stitch anywhere. It'll be at the beginning and the ends of the round, so that it doesn't come apart at the edges, because there's going to be a bit of stretching involved, although we're not using a quilt frame. And now we're just going to take our pins out, and we're going to stretch this out on the table to see just how big it is. Alright, let's just see how big this is. Okay, right now it's approximately 5 feet by 6 feet, and I think that's just a little bit on the small side. So I'm going to go ahead and add another 2 rows to its length and another row or 2 to its width. It'd make a nice tablecloth, but it's not quite big enough for a bed. Alright, so we'll be back when I have this with 2 more sets of rows at each end. Okay folks, the quilt top is finished, and here is how it looks. Now it's laid out on my table because I want to show you the size of it as we walk around it. This is 14 squares long, with an approximation of the finished square being about 6 inches. It's 14 squares long and 12 wide, which is a good sized, twin size quilt, and I'm quite pleased with how it has turned out. So now I'm going to iron it, and we're going to lay it all out in layers, and we're going to assemble it. Okay, folks, what we have here is a flannel sheet. Now, it's not the original flannel sheet that I showed you in the Simple Tide Quilt Part 1, because that was a second-hand one. This is a brand new sheet, and all I've done is I've taken off the sewed edging, the finished edge, and I've draped it over the table. This is a queen size sheet that we never used. And the reason I'm using a queen size sheet is because I want enough fabric around the edges to do the binding. Okay? I'll show you the lovely pattern. Red and green and orange polka dots. We're going to take this blanket and we're going to lay it on top of the sheet. The blanket is now our liner. And we want it, and I do believe this is a twin size blanket. It doesn't really matter because it's all going to get trimmed to fit. Okay. This is very much like we did with Cordelia's baby quilt, only on a bigger scale. All right, let's see. All right, we have sheet hanging down. Make sure this is, we want to make sure we have edging. But once I have all the layers pinned together, before we start stapling it, I will trim the excess. This is the long way. And here we go. Now when I say Simple Tide quilt, I mean we're not using a quilt frame. We're not quilting it by hand stitching. These were the quilts, you know, that were, this is actually going to fit that brown blanket perfect. These were actually the quilts that pioneers made when stuff started to wear out. Because they were faster, much faster than the art pieces that we know of as today. Yeah, I think this is, now, I don't measure, folks. I mean, they'll tell you so many blocks makes so many inch size quilt and all that stuff. The only thing I really measure is when I'm cutting the block pieces. I just make sure it all fits, that's all. Okay, now I have safety pins. And now that this is all laid out, but in the center of each block, we want to put a safety pin. We're starting at the center for a very, very simple reason. And if you do every other block with a safety pin, offset it. For instance, here I have 2 safety pins, and I'm going to do one here. Now the reason we're starting in the center is because sometimes if you start at one end, it's draped over the table, and we want this secure. But it can travel across the table if you start at one end, and you may find at the other end that your layers don't match up. So we start at the center, and that way it smooths everything out to the edges. Now, I ran out of safety pins, so it's a good thing that we started in the center, because now I can start tying the outside edges without fear of this shifting. As you can see, the safety pins have done their job of securing the center of the quilt. Now, like we did with the safety pins, we're going to start in the center and work our way. We're going to start in the center of what is not pinned, because I ran out of safety pins. We're going to start here and we're going to work our way out and down, okay? The reason I left this is 4-ply knitting worsted weight. It's acrylic. It is not wool. And the only reason I'm using it is because A, I have it. It's a very old ball of yarn. B, it's off-white and will go with everything. And C, I wanted to show you it's made in Canada. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a piece of our yarn and we're going to thread our darning needle. Now we don't want a blunt nosed. We want a very, very sharp as you can get, darning needle. Now, some people tie the corners, just the corners of the block. But because there's only 3 pieces to each block, we're just going to tie the center. And all you do is you make sure that you've pierced all 3 layers, and we're going to pull it through, and we're literally going to tie it. This is why it's called a tied quilt. This is the messy part of the job because you're going to have lots of little ends that end up on the floor. Now, one of the reasons I like tying this quilt in the center of each block is because each block has 3 pieces. One block going horizontal, the other going vertical. So as you tie, the next block will offset your ties that go this way, and it's going to make a really nice, secure quilt. Now, if you want, you can tie the corners after that. Excuse me, my dog wants in. Now, this looks like tedious work, folks, but guess what? Nowhere near as tedious as quilting. And like I said, our forefathers, when they had to get quilts done because they needed blankets, sure, they might do nice tops, but they would do simple ones too, like this, and tie them up, and they would put anything in the liners. Old sweaters, you know, old pieces of horse blanket, whatever they had going to line it, because you know what? You could afford to get artistic when all your beds had blankets on them. All right, we will be back when I have this all tied up. Well, there it is, folks. All tied and ready for the binding. All right, friends. Now it's time to put the binding on our quilt. And I wasn't going to. I was just going to use the sheet and fold the edges up. But because it is a tied quilt, the edges can be wonky, out of your control. And so what I did was I just trimmed off the excess, and we are going to use it. All right, we're just going to do the 1/2 inch mark, or the halfway mark. I'm just going to fold it in half. Yep, and it's pretty much even all the way down. I'm going to fold it in half. I'm going to make a snip. Wish me luck, folks. And I'm just going to tear it all the way down the center. Now, essentially what I'm going to do is, when I have all these ready and cut out or ripped out, I'm going to fold them in half like this, and then I'm going to iron them all the way down so we have a nice crisp seam. Alrighty. Now what we're going to do is, before we iron these out, we are going to sew them all end to end. Okay, right sides of work facing, they actually match, so we're just going to whiz that across, because we're going to fold it in on itself to the edge, and we're going to iron it. All right, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pin it, rather, to the cardboard so that it kind of stays in place, and we can just wind it up as we go. All right, let's just... Anyway, when I get this all ironed out, because I'm sure you're bored to tears watching me do this, we will be back. Now what I have done is I have gone ahead and ruthlessly trimmed the edges of my quilt to the best of my ability to be all my 3 layers square. And what we're going to do now is we're going to start pinning binding on. Now the way we do that is we unroll, we leave a little bit at the end because we're going to have to deal with a corner when we get all the way around. And let's hope this does go all the way around. But we're going to start and we're going to snug the edge of our binding right up to the edge of our quilt. And we are just going to pin it, all the layers in place. I'm going to take you to the corner so I can show you, well, I'm not very good at corners. Then like this. I think that's it. I think that's it. And when we sew that in place and fold it over, nope, that's wrong. Well, we'll know when I sew it whether it's right or not, won't we? Okay, I'm going to set my sewing machine up. I'll be right back. Oops. Alrighty. Now, starting, let's see if I can get this so that you can see it better. Starting at the beginning, we are just going to, I don't know why, oh, there we go. I don't know why that's, there, my presser foot's a little wonky. Okay, starting at the beginning, we are going to line up the edge of our binding, which we've lined up with the edge of our quilt, the edge of our binding to the outer edge of our presser foot. You just want to see this little bit of fuzzy edging on the side of your presser foot, no more. Or otherwise you may not have enough fabric to wrap around to the other side. Okay, so and do yourself a favor, folks. Take the pins out as you go so that you don't end up having pins accidentally in your quilt. Now, I made dozens of quilts before I learned how to do a binding. I'm telling you, when my friend Helen showed me how to do this, I slapped myself in the forehead so hard that I could have given myself a concussion. That would explain a lot about me, actually. Now, if I've done it correctly, I should be able to fold this over and have a nice tuck corner, and I do. Thank you, Helen. Okay, now before I go on and do the entire binding, I'm going to show you why we do it this way. All right? We're going to take this binding and we're going to fold it over to the back of the quilt, and we're going to stitch it with an invisible stitch, and that's going to give us our binding all the way around. Isn't that wonderful? We'll be back when I have the binding all in place, and we'll be starting on the invisible stitching. All right, hopefully you can see how this works. Now, you don't have to do it double thread, but I always do. And you don't put a knot in this, okay? You're going to fold your corner together, and you're going to start with your needle, and you're going to push it through, and you're going to pull your thread just until you see the end go in. This is the only really tricky part. Just until you see the end go in. Okay? I can actually see the end a little bit. And then we're going to, just at this corner, we're going to do a couple of stitches just to lock that in place. Okay, now the invisible part is quite easy. And I have my darn it. I'm working around with my arms around the tripod here, folks. Okay, now, you see this stitch where it is. I'm going in through the stitch, and I'm running about 1/8 of an inch along inside the lining of the quilt. It doesn't go all the way through all the layers of fabric. And I just pull that up, and again, I go in through where I came out, under the fabric, and up. Let me show you one more time. In through where the stitch came out, into the lining of the fabric, but not all the way through, and then out. Whoops. Now, they call this invisible stitching because, do you see the stitching? You don't, because you're always going back through where you came up in the first place. All right, I'll be back. Well, there it is, folks, the finished quilt. I still have some invisible stitching to do on the binding, but I'm really quite pleased with how it turned out. I hope that the two videos, Tied Quilt Part 1 and Tied Quilt Part 2, weren't too confusing, so that you can go ahead and begin your own project. Okay, and if you have questions, you can always ask me, and you can always email me. All right, take care, and I hope to see you guys telling me that you're making your own tied quilts. Take care, bye-bye.